morning to everybody. And I'm very, very happy today to introduce you to Tony Martel. Tony's a doctoral candidate working with Janet Cherry in the Development Studies Department at NMMU. Sorry, oops, we dropped the M, hey, so it's Nelson Mandela University. They are working together on the Transition Township project, and Tony will be able to explain better than me what all of that means. Tony did an MA in International Relations at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and a BA in History and Political Science from the University of Vermont. And he's also an active member of the Nelson Mandela Bay Water Crisis Committee. So I think maybe you can get a picture of why ecosocialism attracts him as a kind of thoroughly interdisciplinary theoretical framework for addressing these interconnected global problems arising from a capitalist economy, one of which, of course, is energy. So he's going to chat to us about ecosocialism as a framework and as the basis for the Transition Township's work towards renewables in KwaZakhele, Gqeberha. Janet, I think, will come in later on the series to expand on the practical aspects of that project, and Tony's going to concentrate on ecosocialism as a framework that we can use. So welcome, Tony. Very happy to have you here, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andrea.
Okay.
So originally in this presentation, I was approached by Janet, and we were going to do this together on the Transition Township project, but then basically the suggestion was made that I would sort of give a presentation on the orientation of the actual work that I'm doing for my PhD research as it relates to the project. So I suppose we could say that what I'll be dealing with is sort of the basic premises of ecosocialism, some theoretical aspects of it that I think reflect on the practical orientation of Transition Township. And then, like Andrea said, then Janet will come in later, and then I think sometime in June, and talk about the stuff that's going on the ground in Transition Township. So now I'm going to switch over to the presentation. I'll share my screen, and we can begin. So I titled my presentation, We Make the Road by Walking, Ecosocialism in Theory and Practice. We make the road by walking is a sort of a turn of phrase that's popularized by the autonomous social movement in southern Mexico called the Zapatistas. It's very appropriate for ecosocialism because as a term, it's very non-dogmatic. So it's really a convergence of many different practices, perspectives, and different movements that are oriented around ecological and socialist principles. That being said, I think a number of these principles are, defined or definable in a way. So I think what I'll highlight are some of the more important aspects of ecosocialism that should be noted, in distinction from perhaps other modalities or perspectives of socialism that we are maybe more familiar with. So it's looking at sort of, capitalism is like a contradictory whole in which, there's really within ecosocialism a struggle to replace capitalism as more than just an economic system, but a whole set of relations that encapsulates our way of life. So I say a contradictory whole because it doesn't constitute like the totality of like the universe. You know, it's not all relations of nature, but it uplifts certain psychological elements, certain practices, norms of behavior, and a certain morality to the detriment of others, that implicate all of us within capitalism itself. So I think also within ecosocialism, what's important about that phrase, "we make the road by walking," is that before there was a term ecosocialism, before there was a definable set of ideas that were encapsulated under this category, ecosocialism, people were doing ecosocialism. So another very important aspect of ecosocialism that strikes against you know, certain doctrinal or dogmatic aspects of an ideology is the fact that it's a practice first. It's a practice first that informs a theory and a politics. And you know, with that, I mean, I'll also go into examples of where we can look at how this is a practice. But we could briefly say that you know, ecosocialism is also driven by certain orientations, values, like that motivate relationships and behaviors among people that are cooperation, mutualism, solidarity, the flourishing of life. I mean, these are in you know, distinction from capitalist values that you know, most important, competition, self-interest, you know, these sorts of things that we are all implicated within capitalism. So also ecosocialism is, you know, not something that's like one particular approach, you know, and yeah, there's no privileging of any of these. You know, depending upon a particular context, a reformist or social democratic approach might be more appropriate, depending on the, let's say, the strength of capitalist relations in a particular context, like within the core of economies of like the capitalist system, global capitalist system of Europe and North America. So just very briefly, you know, there's sort of the autonomous path, and I could talk about these a bit more, the Zapatistas, Rojava, Sarvodaya, Shramadana in Sri Lanka. The Zapatistas are in southern Mexico, as I said, and Rojava is in Syria. You know, there's the social democratic path. You know, this is like the Green New Deal that is, you know, being enacted in Europe and North America, United States. There is eco-Leninism that is sort of popularized through the work of Andreas Malm, you know, the book How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and the Salvage Collective. And so just very briefly, like it's in short term, you know, theorizing a war communism where the state, the mechanisms and the instruments of the state would be appropriated to expropriate, you know, all aspects of the production in the economy to, you know, basically end fossil fuel production and drive the use of renewables and sort of eco-centric production. And then another tendency would be direct action. So these are like No DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests that you know, was basically, you know, some frontline defense against ecocide with this oil pipeline in the middle of the United States, you know, by First Nations peoples, the Lakota tribe in the United States. So, you know, there's also a historical perspective that's very important for ecosocialism because, of course, perhaps one of the most important inspirations for eco-socialist struggle are the indigenous ways of life. You know, within Southern Africa, people have been, you know, living here for, you know, hundreds of thousands of years. And there was an ancestral knowledge of peoples in which, there was ways of relating and valuing both one another and the local ecology that was very ecocentric, and so it's not to say that ecosocialism is like a striving to return to something, but it's important to sort of preserve and rediscover some of the ancestral knowledge that's important to relearning what perhaps we've forgotten by having this sort of 500-year relationship with colonialism and capitalism that's detached us and turned nature into an abstraction that driven us into almost extinction, depending on how things go in the next few years. I'll try to go through this faster. The fights against enclosures, with the origins of primitive accumulation, roughly 1066 with William the Conqueror. This sort of like what Marx called primitive accumulation, and the colonialism that developed in centuries subsequent to that, struggles against capitalist technology with the Luddites. There's a book by Gavin Miller where he talks about some of this. It was recently published. Some religious communities like the Quakers and the Bruderhof, who developed, while there's some conservative ethics within those groups, they have a real sense of community connection to a bioregion or a locality, and a more spiritual connection to nature that sort of values the surrounding environment, the world, nature, which exceeds the value that we give to reality or to nature. In maroon communities, there's a lot to say about maroon communities. These are displaced people from the slave trade, basically, who ended up in the Western Hemisphere and escaped, defended their territories in hard to reach places within the Western Hemisphere, and sort of rediscovered and appropriated like their knowledge of their ways of life from the African continent, and basically orchestrated their own self-determination through this. And then lastly, the first modern eco-socialist struggle, which is the Chico Mendes and the Brazilian rubber tappers in the sort of 1970s, 1980s, where there was the first sort of explicit connection of a politics that's dealing with capitalism and ecological struggles. So yeah, in practice, we have different forms and orientations of eco-socialism. The Venezuela and Bolivia both, while they have their constituent antagonisms within the format that they were developing a formulation of eco-socialism, we can say that they have this at least as a stated objective. The Zapatistas have basically created an entirely self-determined territory within the southern state of Chiapas, where they have the basis of consent for society coming from everyday people, in a relationship to the natural environment that's rooted in the indigenous ways of life for the people who predominantly reside in that area. We also have Rojava, that also, much like the Zapatistas, is oriented around communal assemblies, but most importantly, is very women-led and oriented in terms of defending their territory, and highlighting the fight against patriarchy, which is rife in that region as it is everywhere. And then, also the Eco-Socialist International is another example where there is a convergence with a set of principles and strategies that were developed out of this where it took place in northern Venezuela, where there was a vision for how to go forward into the future. And yeah, so I think this is what I want to spend more time on is the theoretical aspects of ecosocialism that I think are important to highlight in distinction from others. So most importantly, within ecosocialism, we look at, like I said before, all sort of capitalist relations, and the ground on which capitalism rests as basically the latest form of domination in a long history that could be taken back to 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. The work of Marija Gqeberha, an archaeologist looking at sort of matriarchal figures in that period, determines that something happened like 5,000, 6,000 years ago as like the origin of patriarchy. So the ground on which capitalism rests is rooted in the exploitation and domination of women. And as this iceberg model here presents, much of Marxism and socialism focuses on what is valued within the market, which is like wage labor, labor contracts, finance. But underneath all of this is the work that is subsumed under market value that is what is detached from the capitalist economy, but is its ground. It's invisible ground. So there's a few principles that I think are most important to highlight about eco-socialism. One particular is prefiguration, which is like a concept that's borrowed from anarchism, in that basically you have to there's a connection between means and ends in some respects, that there's the germ of the world in which you're building is rooted in the way in which you get there. But of course, you have to actually do something to get there. It's not as if capitalism is going to be whisked away on its own. There is going to be a very concerted, strategic and hard path to be fought in order for this to come about. So, and ultimately, it has to be about like every aspect of how we carry out our lives. So the other important thing is comes from a man named James O'Connor, who wrote about the second Marx's second contradiction and its relation to ecological conditions. So I mean, very briefly, we could look at this concept in terms of soil. So under capitalist production, industrial agriculture, you have a commodity like corn that you produce, in large monocultures, plantation production that, requires, in order to reproduce those, that crop, more fertilizer and more pesticides to increase the yields and to expand production continuously. But what that ends up doing is undermining the conditions of production by depriving the soil of nutrients that it's unable to replenish. So ultimately, you end up in a place like the Dust Bowl in the United States during the Great Depression, where the soil was totally deprived of all nutrients, and it just led to a famine, basically. Then, one important thing in ecosocialism that comes from one of its most important theorists, Gqeberha, is this concept of intrinsic value. And I think this is important in terms of understanding how we conceptualize a prefigurative path toward ecosocialism, because while in capitalism, and especially Marx, talked about exchange value, use value, capitalism is a condition in which exchange value predominates over use value. It's a quantification of a commodity, that is an abstraction. It's outside of the actual qualitative application or use of the thing in itself, right? So yeah, use value for KwaZakhele is sort of like the juncture between exchange value and intrinsic value. And while use value is sort of constituted under subsistence production, basically, where you are producing for direct need, a use value doesn't have to be a commodity. A use value can have many different applications. A pen doesn't necessarily have to be appropriated for one particular use if it's going to be used only in this book or whatever. It can be used for other things, and then intrinsic value is sort of this concept that KwaZakhele came about with, which is basically that value within nature is sort of something that exists independent of our valuing of it, and it's sort of builds on this concept of splitting that KwaZakhele developed in terms of how capitalism sort of has these psychological implications on our sense of self. But basically, intrinsic value is developing a sort of proper differentiation with the natural world, where it's sort of a dialectical relationship with understanding that not everything is an appropriation or determined by the production of the human, that the understanding that there is sort of an importance of value in everything that is basically within nature that exceeds the human. And I think this is where sort of spirituality is important for KwaZakhele in terms of getting at something, a deeper meaning that is beyond simple production and direct use or need by people. So also KwaZakhele talked about what Marx described in the Communist Manifesto as sort of the society of free association of producers. So it's not ultimately going to end in public ownership. So basically, production is determined by relations between people, but labor is effectively no longer a concept. Labor is not ontologized as this relation between work and time. That there are other values that are more important that are developed using or through an ecological rationality, which is composed of ecocentric values that connect the person with the place and time. But so I've grounded sort of the premises of ecosocialism and some of its philosophical or theoretical bases. And then it's important then to think about how does this connect to this problem of renewable energy, and how do we get there, and what do we do when we get there? because I think it's absolutely imperative that we have renewable energy. But I think it would, at the same time, it would be an absolute disaster to have renewable energy under a capitalist society. And we can see where, someone like William Stanley Jevons, who was economist in the 19th century, who was looking at coal. And I think John Bellamy Foster writes about this in the Monthly Review, who basically developed what is a premise within ecological economics called the Jevons paradox, where like you have a technology that increases in efficiency through advancements in various developments through scientific or other means, but that very efficiency, which would theoretically lead to some behaviors and conservation of energy, is undermined by its increased application for production or for use. So basically, let's say, for example, you have a more energy efficient car. It doesn't lead to carbon emissions reducing. In some cases, actually really leads to more carbon emissions because it's the incentive to keep producing cars because they're more efficient. So I mean, in particular, looking at electric cars, this is something that we should be paying attention to. I mean, having 1 billion electric cars with lithium-ion batteries is certainly going to be a problem. If we have solar panels in everybody's house, does that consequently lead to increased usages of energy that exceed the solar panels that fit on a particular house? So then, it's developing ecocentric values, perhaps first privileging like the use values of particular community, that orientation around within Transition Township project, a gap tap, and I'll get into that, that production and consumption is emphasized not on within capitalism, things like conspicuous consumption and endless streaming of Netflix or what have you, but that ultimately this transition to renewable energy is about transforming society beyond the means of production, but I guess you could also say the means of consumption. I mean, the psychological, the moral, the normative or ethotic dimensions of life that we conduct ourselves every single day, and that basically we have developed sort of energy commons by this transformation of life, that it's not purely a technological problem, because the technology is there, of course, but that energy in itself is not constituted as a resource in the sense that it is now. That this sense of scarcity is eroded, and become sort of that basically the other values are sort of predominates over that relationships to develop or predominate over the concept of like having X units of electricity, for example. And yeah, so with Transition Township, and Janet can explain more about this also when she presents later, you can see here, we've got a solar carport structure that's 5 kilowatts, models a single household that, theoretically, are for the 36 households that sit around this open public space where the structure sits, would have, that they produce electricity, and the aim is ultimately to basically transform the ESCOM into a decentralized democratic electricity utility, where every household, at least beginning in this gap tap, then hopefully across the country has solar power, and that basically this means that hopefully a sense of self-reliance develops amongst people, because they have money for which they can basically live a decent life, where they if they're even able to get a job, don't have to go work at some exploitative place of business like a spa or supermarket, where they only get to keep a fraction of the value of their labor. And that this enhances some form of democratic practice, because this is organized as a cooperative, so everybody gets a fair share of the electricity that's produced, because it's on the basis of each household that membership is attributed to the cooperative. But what I want to think about is basically how I outlined the premises of ecosocialism, sort of the long view of looking at where we need to go. I think, and also with the very distinct crisis that we're facing, that when we get there, like Transition Township, when we get there, we have democratized energy in communities. Now, how do we basically orient the consciousness of people within, and how does this develop basically in the process, independent of any intervention? I mean, basically, if you have household cooperatives with electricity that are connected to the grid, how does the relationship to energy and to people's wants and needs, desires, how do they stay in the community as well? I think that's a very important question. And then the other is, I think maybe the most important, which is how do we reconcile existing energy poverty with the ecological limitations facing us? And I guess it's not just energy poverty, but it's just economic deprivation, unemployment, and the fact that I think the case of water is perhaps a good way of thinking about this. I was told recently that the World Bank is talking to political officials in South Africa, politicians and people in municipalities, and basically trying to disabuse them of this idea that desalination is a real answer to the water crisis, because there's no way around it. At some point, we really are running up against a brick wall, and there isn't any sort of magical fix that's going to change things. I mean, we really have to. It is going to be a fight, to negotiate and struggle for, a fair system of using energy resources, and democratic decision making. But what would ecosocialism would ask is that also this must be connected to the boundaries of the environment in which we exist, because of course, if we have a set of desires, a set of needs that are going to push us beyond what the environment can provide, then of course we basically undermine the basis for our own survival. We can't reproduce ourselves every day if that's the case. But the other thing is that it doesn't produce a life in which we're happy, or that we have any meaning. We don't have any meaningful life. So, we need to sort of reconcile and develop, a sense of understanding of the environment in which we live. And that's why also these ancestral ways of living are so important, because they're an example that contains within them that the fact that, you know, we evolved as humans to understand and have a deep relationship with the world around us. The Hadza hunter-gatherer tribe in northern Tanzania is referenced by this group of anthropologists called the Radical Anthropology Group as a key example of, you know, well, their argument is this is in fact how humans evolve. You know, probably perhaps the most egalitarian community on Earth. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there, and then perhaps we can do questions.
Thanks, Tony. Would you mind maybe putting your your screen sharing off, and then we can hopefully see people. So if you would like to raise questions, either pop a note in the chat, hopefully stick your video on, or raise your hand. And I'm assuming that Gary's video on, Dr. Kukumur's video was on because he would like to raise a question. Am I right about that?
Thanks, Andrea. Yes, I'm not quite used to that title. Tony, thanks very much for that input. And I think that looking at the indigenous models is a critical way forward. What I'm interested in is the issue of scale. So in terms of competition and consumerism, so indigenous models seem to work to a certain threshold point in terms of size of the community, and then it starts collapsing after that. So, you know, so a city of ours of 1.2, 1.3 million, you couldn't, indigenous models for us, just in terms of scale and what's needed here, isn't possible anymore. That's my assumption. I'm interested in terms of ecosocialism, how you see things working at scale rather than sort of pockets of indigenous communities that work, but they work because they are closed, smaller communities. You know, there's this theory about 150 people being the sort of optimal size. But yeah, so I'm interested in terms of how you guys, or how ecosocialism would see that.
Yeah, should I just go ahead and respond?
Yes, do.
Okay, yeah, I mean, so this is a question of coordination, and a question of leadership. That is very much an open question. And why I would say that, you know, these other tendencies that I listed before, like, you know, there's the eco-Leninist approach, there's, you know, the autonomous approach, and others that I think make for basically finding a way to get to where we need to be. I think in terms of you know, indigenous modes of living, I mean, you know, I think, okay, so there's two things. The first thing is that, you know, what's important about the example of indigenous ways of living is the fact that just like some of these, in a way, like these religious communities, like the Bruderhof, for example, that there is a, you know, connection to the earth that is, well, I can't say it any other way, but, you know, spiritual, in the sense that, like, you know, the value, there's a recognition of the fact that the value that is on earth is exceeds, you know, our appropriation of it. So having a sort of differentiated relationship with the planet that understands that, like, our environment is, like, you know, that we can sort of have a gratitude and a deeper understanding of the earth. John Trudell is a Native American in North America, who basically says it's not the old way, it's not the new way, it's the way of the earth, and there's like no other way, you know. So yeah, exactly. Like there's no going back. I mean, certainly not. But the question of scale I mean, the way that I would like to see eco-socialism is almost more like from an anarchist perspective. So it's looking at, the basis of consent for decision-making coming from everyday people. And whatever the size of the group may be, and however that's negotiated, the problem of coordination of in planning, sort of some sort of decentralized planning. I mean, these are real questions that we have to deal with. And I think, Transition Township is basically one way of point of intervention of trying to think about, well, how do we do it,
Thanks, Tony. Other questions? There's a hand, Enver.
Well, it's not a question. It's just to enter the discussion. Tony, thanks very much. That was a very useful. I hope we can get copies of the presentation emailed or in whatever form. But to just engage in the question that Gary asked Tony, I mean, I understand your response about a new approach to Gaia, to the universe, et cetera, but I think the question about scale is a very important and real question. And I think that the answer for all of us about these new approaches to the ecology, socialistic approaches, is that we really don't resolve that problem. But what we begin to, I think what Tony's presentation and similar presentations around eco-socialism are pointing to, they are prefigurative ways of beginning to do things which, through practice, will have to confront the question of scale over time. But they don't resolve that problem immediately, because clearly questions of power and global reach of the market-based system and so on are the ultimate, in some senses, the ultimate barrier which one has to overcome. And starting precisely at the level of the local in prefigurative townships, I hope we're going to hear more about that, is to sow the seeds of an alternative approach against, the idea that there is no alternative. That's what I think is the present answer to this problem of scale. Thanks.
Thanks, Enver. Tony, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I agree with Enver that the answer that should have come with Gary's question is about prefigurative practice, because I don't have an answer, and I think it's very consciously open-ended that these questions of scale are addressed in the way in which the struggle is sort of conducted. Joel Covell talked about pockets of eco-socialism, sort of as a global movement that, depending on the strength of capitalist relations in particular contexts within the globe, you'll have, the predominance of predominance in terms of eco-socialism, maybe not the best because it's, striving to not dominate, but that, it will rise, and replace capitalism some places. You might have, stronger or weaker possibilities within other contexts. And then, they connect eventually. And then, it develops from there. Yeah.
Hopefully, yeah. Okay, thanks, Tony. Julia, you have your hand up.
Thanks very much. Sorry, I was a bit late I think I missed kind of the first part of the presentation. I'm Julia. I'm from the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at WITS. And it's great to have these kinds of conversations. And I guess I have a similar theme to the questions that have been asked already, which is kind of where does the state go, and how do we, how is so not only is capitalism overcome, but the state is also overcome in your kind of conception in this kind of anarchist approach. And I guess a question for me around energy is that there's this argument that actually, the energy system is something that does need to be centralized because of kind of what you mentioned about efficient use of energy and transmission systems. And, there's like a reason for a central state owned entity in order to have an efficient energy system. But I guess, maybe I'm answering the question, but I guess perhaps the argument is that production would change as well, and there wouldn't be, and consumption would change, and that you wouldn't maybe have as much consumption necessarily, so you wouldn't require that efficiency. But any kind of thoughts on that? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, the question, the state is again, I think another open question, the relationship to the state. I think what I was sort of the picture I was painting was sort of this concept that Lenin and Marx both had, sort of this place you get to where there is the withering away of the state. They both talked about that. Sort of going back to this 19th century idea of the commune of the communes, the universal commune, that, whether, there's many arguments about how Marx, looked at, the Paris Commune, for example, as sort of one mode of development of, the state, at some level, yeah, in terms of efficiency and the importance of having a central utility, this is another important question for energy, because of course, with a centralized utility, there isn't this direct relationship between the person and the source of their energy. So for example, they have, places where they have microgrids, like Casa Pueblo in Puerto Rico, they just did a microgrid. And another person named Alexander Dunlap, who's done work down in southern Mexico, talks about this, where his argument is that basically having the energy source connected to your consumption as a person develops a relationship in which you figure out what energy needs you have or you don't need. This person, Alexander Dunlap, basically talks about how centralized grids sort of produce this addiction. They are conducive to this sort of addiction to energy. I think, again, I wouldn't give any definitive answer. I think these are open questions, and it really is, it's a means of trying to get to eco-socialism. And of course, the path to getting there might make sense in one particular context, maybe not another. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
probably sort of, hey. But Gary, you have a hand up. Was that an old hand? Would you like to jump in there?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Tony and Enver, for coming in there. So the thing that I think about is that renewables is a decentralized system where it can operate on a decentralized basis, whereas coal and nuclear, and that requires a centralized system. They can't operate as decentralized units. So the technology is key in the system that you can design around it and what it allows. So in terms of people becoming prosumers rather than consumers of energy, there's a fundamental change that renewables brought about. But renewables, the reason that we can talk about renewables is because mainly Germany instituted a policy of deliberately going to renewables, and China then was able to supply at a very low cost in comparison, and that's then created a scale a scale and efficiency component, which now allows you the renewables. And the same thing happened with Vespas and the wind industry, is that you have to get it to a sort of critical threshold before those technologies become commonplace. But you know, so would an eco-socialist system have created renewable energy? You know, so you know, indigenous. So I mean, it comes back to the scale thing that I'm struggling with. Is that I you know, I mean, I think the model that's being used in KwaZakhele is a fantastic model in terms of local communities generating power and generating revenue through that. But the very, very real problem is that the municipality derives 30% of its income from electricity generation. So that community opting out, which a lot of businesses are doing at the same time, and suburban homes, means that there's a lot less revenue going through to the municipality to be able to do the things like roads and other health services. You know, so the indigenous view of that we are part of nature, not separate from nature, which is fundamentally opposed to the capitalist view, which is we are separate from nature, which, you know, and that stems from the sort of Eurocentric view. I mean, I agree with that fully, but I still can't get to the people living in cities returning to a kind of low energy, low yeah, I don't know what the term would be, but that kind of lifestyle, I'm not sure that in my view that ship has sailed, that we can't, I don't know that we'll be able to get 7 billion people back into that kind of lifestyle, that configuration.
Yeah, I mean, I think okay, so the point about the transition township, I think with the revenue model, I mean, you're not wrong. I think you know, the municipality sort of sees, they're not really sure. I think they see this project as some sort of like a threat. I don't think they understand the fact that basically how it works, or the proposal is that the co-op would sell electricity back to the municipal grid. So it's sort of, you know, in a way competing with Eskom to be the source of electricity generation. And you know, I mean, I think, you know, it's an open question about like what kind of revenue can be generated. What kind of revenue can be generated from electricity, is, you know, the fluctuation in prices and things like this, and when it actually gets implemented. The question about, you know, whether or not cities, you know, can sort of live or operate in the way that it would be ecocentric. I think there's one important example that we can't leave out, which is well, there's the entire country of Cuba during the special period. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, from 1989 until I don't know, was 1992? Can't remember, but you know, that is to this date the most successful example of agroecology in urban agriculture that has been put into practice. And you know, that could be an argument for eco-Leninism. Basically, it was, you know, there was no other choice. The Cuba, because the Soviet Union collapsed, didn't have another source for petroleum. So they had a blockade by the United States. They couldn't get any imports or anything. So they implemented like vertical agriculture on walls. They had these raised agriculture beds, and it was a very low energy lifestyle. People were very healthy. You know, and I had a professor who wrote about this when I was doing my master's. So I think that indeed it is possible. The problem is very vexing, and I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution whatsoever. There's going to be particular contextual circumstances that are going to make the possibility more or less viable in a particular part of a city, or one city or another. but indeed, I think there are examples of where this has happened. Yeah, I don't think everybody, it would be impossible to get everybody to leave cities. I mean, more than half of the human population lives in cities. It's like 54%, to going up to 60% by 2030, I think. So there's no way, and it would be a disaster if that were to happen. People were to leave cities, but you know, cities are desertification machines. I mean, they pump water, you know, whether it's sewage, which might be almost half of all the water that goes into the city, or it's, so we have to develop another relationship to these things. And I think that there are, like, in terms of methods and technology, it's all there, but it's all about the relationships that are the most key.
Thanks, Tony. Perhaps we need to move to Julia's question on chat, which is provocative. Julia, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I don't know how useful it is, but I guess I was just kind of imagining how cities would revert to, or maybe not revert, but transition into a different way of life. And I mean, I happen to have watched that Mushroom Apocalypse series recently, and it was quite interesting because they talk about they kind of show different models that emerge from that. And I guess, yeah, is it going to, I guess a question for me, maybe the question here is, what is the process of change? How will it happen? Do you have any thoughts about that? Because it's hard to conceptualize. And so apocalypse comes to mind, which is definitely not what we want to get to, I guess.
But it's on everybody's mind. That's why I wanted to bring it up. So I think it's an important question. Thanks, Julia. Tony?
There's the accelerationist argument, which I don't know if that's what you're talking about. But yeah, that one I feel would be basically swept up within reactionary forces. The philosopher Nick Land, who sort of is a proponent of this dark enlightenment thing that Peter Thiel, who's one of the Silicon Valley billionaires, is a big proponent of. He's also, major reactionary force in American politics. But there's also like what's often written about is the mutual aid that takes place in disasters. They call it, like, in some cases, disaster anarchism, like looking at Hurricane Katrina as a case, in this solar microgrid in Adjuntas in Puerto Rico called Casa Pueblo. It's a mountainous region. The grid went down in 2019 during Hurricane Maria. It was a centralized, privatized grid that just completely failed. And basically, out of necessity, they built this grid. I wouldn't like to say that it would require an apocalypse. I think that where there is sufficient political will, where there is what I would say organized masses, is where it would, something like this would be the most effective. I mean, there is nothing that will stop in the way of people getting together and fighting for this kind of change, but it requires high levels of organization, and people need to be mobilized. So how does that come about? I mean, I don't really have an answer.
Thanks, Tony. None of us have answers to this. We're all pretty anxious because it seems as if this transition has to happen, but it has to happen now. And it has to happen widespread and fast. So all of those things seem like they're impossible. But thank you. I mean, you have raised for me, I think, about 6 different massive questions, which I haven't asked you, but we are out of time. So you're out of the hot seat for now. But I think that this is a discussion that we will continue having, especially around energy. So thanks very much for kicking us off. And we will, in June, as Tony said, we will get Janet to speak to us about the other half of the Tony-Janet duo, which is a more detailed explanation of the Transition Township project. We will later on in the series have Julia on energy racism, as far as I recall. And all of the seminars are recorded. This is speaking to Enver's question, and placed on YouTube. What I'm going to do is on all of the seminar invitations, I'll put the links of previous seminars below the actual flyer. So that's one way in which you can access them. Otherwise, just Google Everything is Energy or Iscia seminar or something like that on YouTube, and I'm sure you'll get to it somehow. Otherwise, email me and I'll send you the links directly. Okay, so thank you very, very much for joining us, Tony. This is a conversation that, as I said, we really, really, really want to and need to continue. And we are very glad to have started it. And yes, unfortunately, we're out of time, and I will wish you all a fabulous weekend in nature, maybe. If you are in the city, maybe go out and enjoy. I mean, yeah, that's what I'm planning to do, which is why I'm suggesting it for everyone else. I'm going to spend a day out. Okay, thanks so much, and see you all next week. Okay, bye.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.